There's a farmhouse still standing in eastern Kentucky. No one lives there anymore. The windows are boarded up, and the front porch sags like a mouthful of missing teeth. But if you ask the older folks in town about it, they'll change the subject, fast. They'll tell you it's condemned, dangerous, but that's not why they won't talk about it. They won't talk about it because of what happened inside those walls for nearly 100 years. Because of what the Langston men did to their sisters, and because one of them finally said, no, this isn't folklore, this isn't legend, this is documented, recorded, whispered about in county courthouses, and faded marriage certificates that should never have been signed. The Langston family kept a secret that violated every natural law, every social boundary, every instinct we have as human beings. And they kept it going, generation after generation, like a curse written into their blood. Tonight, you're going to hear the full story, the one the town buried, the one that makes people uncomfortable at dinner tables when someone mentions that old farmhouse on the hill. You're going to learn how it started, why it continued, and how it finally ended. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll understand why some doors should stay closed. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Langston family arrived in Kentucky in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. They were running from something most people were back then. They bought 300 acres of land so far from town that supplies came once a month if they were lucky. They built that farmhouse with their own hands, and they lived by their own rules. Because out there, in the hills, no one was watching, no one was asking questions. And that isolation, that distance from the eyes of society, became the breeding ground for something unspeakable. The first son, Jacob Langston, married his sister Anne in 1879. She was 16, he was 19, and from that moment on, the pattern was set. The marriage certificate still exists. It's kept in a locked drawer in the county clerk's office, and they don't like to show it to researchers. But it's there, Jacob Langston and Anne Langston. Same last name before the wedding. Same parents listed on their birth records. The clerk who filed it knew. He had to have known. But in 1879, in a county where the Langstons owned more land than anyone else, where they paid their taxes in cash and kept to themselves, you didn't ask questions. You stamped the paper and you moved on. Anne gave birth to 6 children in that farmhouse, 4 boys, 2 girls. The infant mortality rate was high back then, especially in rural areas, but all 6 of Anne's children survived. That was unusual. Some historians believe it's because the family had access to better nutrition, better shelter. Others believe it's because Anne fought like hell to keep them alive, knowing what was waiting for at least one of them. Because by the time her oldest son turned 17, the pattern continued. His name was Thomas, and the girl chosen for him was his sister, Mary. There are no records of resistance, no police reports, no letters to clergy, no desperate pleas hidden in attic floorboards. The family operated like a closed system, a sealed world where the rules inside the farmhouse were the only rules that mattered. Thomas married Mary in 1897. She was 15. He was 17. They had 5 children together, and the cycle repeated. By the time the 1900s arrived, 3 generations of Langston men had married their sisters. It wasn't a secret in the way we think of secrets. People in town knew. But knowing and speaking are 2 very different things. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the act itself. It's the infrastructure that supported it, the silence, the complicity, the way an entire community saw what was happening and chose, consciously or not, to let it continue. Because the Langstons had money, they had land, they employed people, and in a small town where survival often depended on not making enemies, you learned to look the other way. You learned that some families were allowed to live by different rules. And the Langston family took full advantage of that unspoken agreement. The farmhouse became a place where morality bent under the weight of isolation and power. And inside those walls, the children grew up knowing their future before they could understand what it meant. By 1923, the pattern had held for 3 generations. But something crucial happened during this time that explains how the cycle perpetuated itself. The Langston children weren't raised like other children. They were homeschooled, isolated, taught that their family was different, special, even. The outside world was painted as dangerous, corrupt, impure. The farmhouse was safety. The family was everything. And most importantly, they were taught that what happened between brothers and sisters in the Langston family was not just acceptable, it was tradition, sacred even. Psychologists who have studied similar cases talk about something called normalization through isolation. When you grow up in an environment where the unthinkable is treated as normal, where there's no outside reference point, no other reality to compare it to, your moral compass calibrates to your surroundings. The Langston children didn't have friends from other families. They didn't attend public schools. They didn't go to church socials where they might have seen how other families functioned. Their entire understanding of human relationships was built inside that farmhouse, under the control of parents who had themselves been raised in the same system. The eldest son in each generation was groomed from childhood to accept his role. He was given more responsibility, more authority, more attention. He was told he would carry on the family name, the family legacy. And when the time came, usually around his 17th or 18th birthday, the transition happened with a kind of ceremonial weight. There would be a family dinner. The father would give a speech about duty, about bloodline, about keeping the family pure. And then the marriage would be arranged, not announced arranged. Because by that point, the son had been so thoroughly conditioned that resistance wasn't even a concept he could fully form in his mind. The daughters, meanwhile, were raised in a different kind of prison. They were taught submission, obedience, silence. They were told that their purpose was to serve the family, to bear children, to maintain the home. The younger daughters who weren't chosen for their brothers often remained unmarried, living in the farmhouse their entire lives, helping to raise the next generation of children who would perpetuate the cycle. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining system of abuse that fed on isolation and control. And for nearly 70 years, it worked. Until 1947, when a boy named Daniel Langston was born, the boy who would eventually break the curse. Daniel Langston was born in 1947, the eldest son of Robert and Catherine Langston. Catherine was Robert's sister. By the time Daniel came into the world, the pattern had held for 4 complete generations. But 1947 was different than 1879. The world had changed. World War II had just ended. Soldiers were coming home with stories from places the Langstons had never seen. Radios were becoming common, even in rural areas. And most importantly, the government was starting to pay attention to things it had ignored before. Things like education requirements, child welfare, and marriage laws. Daniel grew up aware of the outside world in a way his father and grandfather never had been. The farmhouse got electricity in 1952. They got a radio in 1954. And even though the family still controlled what Daniel heard and saw, cracks were forming in the isolation. He heard news broadcasts. He heard music. He heard stories about people who lived differently, loved differently, chose differently, and something in him began to question what he'd been taught. He had 3 sisters. The oldest, Ruth, was 2 years younger than him. From the time Daniel turned 14, there were whispers in the house, glances between his parents, conversations that stopped when he entered the room. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it happen to his father, heard stories about his grandfather and great-grandfather. The pattern was like a weight hanging over him, growing heavier every year. But unlike the men before him, Daniel had something they didn't have: doubt. That small, persistent voice that said, "This isn't right. This isn't normal. This isn't what I want." When Daniel was 16, a county social worker came to the farmhouse. It was routine, part of a new state program checking on homeschooled children. The visit lasted 20 minutes. The social worker asked Daniel a few questions, looked at his schoolwork, and left. But in those 20 minutes, Daniel had contact with someone from outside the family who treated him like a person, not a piece of the Langston legacy. She asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. No one had ever asked him that before, because in the Langston family, your future was already decided. You didn't want, you obeyed. But that question planted something in Daniel's mind, a possibility. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a door he could walk through. A way out. Daniel turned 18 in 1965. His sister Ruth was 16. The family gathered around the dinner table on a cold February night, and Daniel's father stood up to give the speech. The same speech his father had given him. The same speech that had been given for nearly a century. About duty. About bloodline. About keeping the family strong and pure. About the marriage that would take place in 3 months. After Ruth's 17th birthday, Daniel sat there, hands folded in his lap, listening to words that felt like stones dropping into his stomach. And when his father finished and looked at him, waiting for acceptance, waiting for the nod that every Langston son had given before him, Daniel spoke. He said no. The silence that followed was absolute. His mother's fork clattered against her plate. His younger sisters stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. His father's face went white, then red. No one in living memory had refused. No one had even considered refusing. The word itself felt like blasphemy in that room. Daniel's father demanded an explanation. Daniel told him he wouldn't marry Ruth. He wouldn't continue the pattern. He said it was wrong. That word wrong landed like a gunshot. Because in the Langston family, what they did wasn't wrong. It was tradition. It was survival. It was identity. And Daniel had just called all of it into question. What happened next was not a calm conversation. It was an eruption. Daniel's father raged. He threatened. He told Daniel he would be disowned, disinherited, cast out with nothing. Daniel's mother wept. She begged him to reconsider, told him he was destroying the family, betraying everything their ancestors had built. But Daniel had made his decision. He'd spent 2 years planning this moment. He had $73 hidden in his room. He had a contact in town, a man who'd offered him work at a sawmill. And he had something none of the Langston men before him had possessed, the belief that life outside the farmhouse was possible. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Daniel left that night. He walked out of the farmhouse with nothing but the clothes on his back and the money in his pocket. He didn't say goodbye to Ruth. He couldn't. Years later, he would say that was the part that haunted him most, leaving her there, knowing what his refusal meant for her future. But he also knew that if he stayed, if he gave in, the curse would continue through him. His children would inherit it, and he couldn't live with that. Daniel Langston disappeared into the world beyond the farmhouse, and for the family he left behind, it was as if the ground had opened beneath them. The system they'd maintained for nearly a century had depended on absolute compliance. Every son had accepted his role. Every daughter had submitted to hers. The family had survived by never questioning, never deviating, never breaking the pattern. And now, for the first time, the pattern was broken. What happened next reveals just how deeply the curse had embedded itself into the family's identity. Ruth was never married. After Daniel left, his father tried to arrange a marriage between Ruth and a distant cousin, someone far enough removed that it might appear acceptable to outside eyes. But Ruth refused. Something in Daniel's act of defiance had awakened something in her too. She was sent to live with an aunt in another county, and the family stopped speaking her name at dinner. She died in 1998, unmarried, childless, carrying the weight of that night with her for 33 years. In her later years, she told a social worker that Daniel had saved her, even though he'd never come back for her. He'd shown her that refusal was possible, that the curse could be broken. Daniel's father never recovered from the humiliation. In a community where reputation was everything, where the Langston name had commanded respect through silence and fear, his son's rejection was a public wound. He withdrew from what little social contact the family maintained. The farmhouse became even more isolated. His 2 younger daughters grew up in a home filled with bitterness and rage, a place where Daniel's name was forbidden and his photograph was burned. When his father died in 1981, the obituary listed 3 children. Daniel was not among them. He had been erased. But Daniel's choice had consequences beyond his immediate family. Word spread. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, even a business no one talked about, people began asking questions. Why did the eldest Langston boy run away? Why did the family suddenly stop attending even the occasional town function? And slowly, quietly, the truth began to surface. Not in newspapers or official investigations. It was still too taboo, too dangerous to speak openly, but in whispers. In conversations behind closed doors. In the way people started looking at the Langston family differently. The protection that silence had provided for generations began to crumble. And with it, the family's power began to fade. Daniel Langston lived the rest of his life under a different name. He moved 3 states away, worked in construction, married a woman he met at a diner in 1968. They had 2 children. He never told his wife about the farmhouse, about what his family had expected him to do, about the sister he'd left behind. He carried it alone, the way survivors of unthinkable things often do. It wasn't until 2003, when a graduate student researching genealogical anomalies in Appalachian communities stumbled across marriage records in that Kentucky county, that the full scope of the Langston family history began to come to light. The researcher found pattern after pattern. Same surnames before and after marriage, siblings listed as spouses, birth records that revealed genetic relationships the marriage certificates tried to hide. She brought her findings to a professor, who brought them to a historian, who eventually published a carefully worded paper about an intermarriage in isolated communities. The Langston name was changed in the publication, but people in that Kentucky town knew exactly which family was being discussed. And finally, after more than a century, the silence broke. Daniel was 71 years old when a journalist tracked him down in 2018. At first, he refused to talk. Then, slowly, he began to tell his story. He spoke about the weight of expectation, the suffocating control, the way the family had built an entire reality that contradicted everything the outside world knew to be true. He spoke about his sister Ruth, and he wept. He said he'd spent 53 years wondering if he'd made the right choice, if leaving had been brave or cowardly, if he should have fought harder to take her with him. The journalist asked him what he wanted people to understand. Daniel said this: "Evil doesn't always look like evil when you're born into it. It looks like love. It looks like tradition. It looks like a family. And breaking free from it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like betrayal." The farmhouse still stands, empty now for more than 20 years. The last Langston died in 2004. There were no children to inherit the property. The land was sold off piece by piece to pay debts and taxes. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to go inside, but most won't. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because the building itself feels wrong, like a place where terrible things happened for so long that the walls absorbed it. Researchers have tried to determine exactly how many marriages occurred between Langston siblings over the century. The best estimate is 7. 7 generations of brothers and sisters, bound together by a pattern that masqueraded as tradition. 7 generations of children born into a system designed to perpetuate itself, and one man who said no. Daniel Langston died in 2021 at the age of 73. His obituary mentioned that he was a veteran, a father, a grandfather. It did not mention where he came from or what he escaped. But in that Kentucky town, in the whispered conversations that still happen when someone drives past that old farmhouse on the hill, Daniel's name is remembered differently than the others, not as part of the curse, but as the one who broke it, the one who proved that even patterns carved into blood and bone can be shattered by a single act of refusal, the one who chose to walk away from everything he'd ever known because staying would have meant becoming something he couldn't live with. The Langston family story isn't just about what happened in that farmhouse. It's about what happens when communities choose silence over intervention, when power and isolation create spaces where the unthinkable becomes routine, when tradition is used as a shield for abuse, and it's about the cost of breaking free not just for the person who escapes, but for everyone left behind. Daniel saved himself, but he couldn't save them all, and that's the truth he carried until the day he died. Some curses don't end cleanly. Some break jagged, leaving wounds that never fully heal. But they break, and sometimes that has to be enough. If this story has shaken you the way it should, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most dangerous secrets are the ones entire communities agree not to talk about, until someone finally does. Thank you for watching.